Welcome to Scene Change, a podcast by the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division. All about equality, opportunity, accessibility, and the arts. Here, you'll learn adaptive techniques from performers in the know. We are changing what it means to be blind, one stage at a time. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Scene Change. I'm Lizzie Muhammad Park, the Vice President of the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division, and your host of the show. Today, we have an outstanding episode for you because it's different than anything we've ever done before. All the way from Texas, we've got, and I must mention here that she did graduate from a branch of Texas A&M. We've got a blind model, Britt Culp. Welcome to the show, Britt.
Hey, Lizzie. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We are so glad to have you. And I know that you do other things in addition to modeling, fitness, you have a business, so on and so forth. So do feel free to weave in those other businesses and activities as appropriate. So let's just jump right in. When I heard that there was a blind model, I don't know if you are, one of the only ones currently in the U.S. or, what the stats on that are. But when I heard that there was a blind model, I thought that is so cool because there are so many, and to warn you, we're getting deep right off the bat. There's so many self-esteem problems within the blindness community. Women in general, sometimes we can have, different, issues surrounding, our looks and body image and so on and so forth. But blind women are so often treated as babies, right? Like we're not viewed as hot or dateable or attractive, anything like that. But models, are, the people who girls want to be and, who people want to be. That's like the whole point. And who other people want to date, right? Did you always have the confidence skills to be a model, a beauty queen, just all of the stereotypes that go along with this profession?
Absolutely not. I grew up feeling a lot of the same ways that you just expressed because, society tells women in general certain things about themselves that aren't necessarily true, especially now in modern times. But then whenever you add being a part of another minority group, whether you're LGBTQ or a person of color, or you have a disability, then it's like all these other social cues that we're fed from a very young age about who we are and what we're supposed to believe about ourselves kind of affect the way that we see ourselves internally. So definitely growing up, I grew up in a very small town and I was kind of like the token blind person. There was like maybe two other blind students that, had visual impairments as well, but I was never really told I was pretty. So it wasn't really until probably like my senior year of high school that I even started not necessarily being told, but being kind of told things like, wow, you're so tall, like you should do modeling or little things like that. And of course I didn't believe it because I was just never encouraged or anything like that. And I never saw myself that way. So for me, I really didn't get into modeling until I moved to Austin for a year to get blindfold training at Chris Cole Rehabilitation Center. And when I was there was a casting on the radio at this modeling and acting academy where Wilhelmina Model Management was going to be there. And if you don't really know much about the industry, Wilhelmina Model Management is one of the top modeling companies, agencies, if you will. There's tons of other ones nowadays, but yeah, like especially back in like 2010, they were still up, on the rise and everything like that, and very popular. They have been for many years. So anyway, I originally started out as a singer. So I went because they were looking for singers, actors, dancers, and models, all kinds of talent, really. So I went in there and auditioned as a singer. And then it was in front of two agents. And one of the agents said, you know, you have a really beautiful voice, but do you play an instrument? And I said, well, no, even though I was like trying to learn how to play the guitar at the time. She's like, do you write your own music? And I was like, well, I write, but I've never really composed music. And she said, okay, so it's really hard to break into the music industry if you don't write your own music and have these other facets that kind of take being a vocalist and an artist to the next level. And she said, have you ever thought about modeling? And I thought she was just like, I don't know, joking with me. And she was like, well, because you have a really good look for modeling and your height is really well, because I'm 5'8". For runway and fashion modeling, usually they want you to be 5'9" and up, but 5'8" is acceptable depending on, you know, the market that you're trying to get into. So most commercial models are 5'8" and under, and all kinds of shapes and sizes, especially nowadays. So anyway, she told me, she's like, you know, you should really look into getting some formal training and then come back to a casting like this. And I'm pretty sure you would have something really unique to offer. So that was back in 2010. And I just kind of slept on it. So I came back to Kingsville, which is where I went to college, Texas A&M Kingsville. And I started getting into fitness and I lost a bunch of weight, not because I was trying to be a model, just because I wanted, you know, to feel better about myself and be healthy. And I don't know, it was something just told me like, hey, like maybe you should just explore this and see if it's something that you like. So I got some photos taken by some local photographers. I joined a bunch of online modeling and photography groups on Facebook. And that's how you kind of like build your portfolio. And you're doing like what we call TFP, which is trade for print, but nowadays everything's digital. So you're basically trading your time with another photographer. Like if they want to expand their swimwear photos with models and that's something that you do, well, then it's kind of like a quid pro quo situation. You need those photos for your portfolio and they need their photos for their portfolio. So, or it could be like a photographer who's just starting out and you're a model just starting out. So you're kind of collaborating together and exchanging each other's time. So it's mutually beneficial. So that's what I did. And I just started kind of networking with all kinds of photographers. And then after that is when I got into fitness, like for the bodybuilding side of things, because I am a nationally qualified bodybuilder. And that just kind of opened more doors for me, because then that kind of transitioned me into the fitness modeling category. And that's when it really took off for me, because fitness models, especially down in my area, are really hard to come by until you go up north, like Dallas and the bigger cities. But in my area specifically, there's not very many. So that's when I just kind of started to become known as the blind fitness model, for lack of better terminology. And I think it's once I started working on my fitness is when I really started developing that confidence, because it gave me a sense of empowerment and control that I never felt before. And I think that anybody with a disability can attest to that. Like your disability, you know, it's something you're born with, or something happens that's out of your control that made you that way. And it kind of feels like you're helpless for a little while. Like it was something that wasn't a choice and it wasn't in your control. But with fitness, like that was 100% up to me. I'm the one who decides if I'm going to go to the gym that day or not. I'm the one who's going to push myself and say, okay, one more set, one more rep, 10 more minutes, whatever it is. So that's really where that confidence, I think, came from. And it just translated into other aspects of my life.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to delve deeper into some of the things that you mentioned in there. First of all, Wilhelmina is huge. For those who don't know about, modeling, it's very big. So, I mean, and they're big for modeling. I didn't realize that they had a singing or musical component to their company. But, you know, like, I know back in the day, like America's Next Top Model was like the show to watch. And I don't know if they were around then or not, but I know it was companies like Wilhelmina that, Tyra Banks would get the people on the show connected.
Yeah,
with.
It was Wilhelmina, Elite, Ford, Storm, those big ones. Yeah,
exactly. So as far as going to that casting call, I mean, did you just show up? Did you just, how'd you find out about it when you were going? Were you nervous? Like, what's that like, just jumping into it?
So I heard about it on the radio, and like I kept hearing about it, and there were like some friends I made there at the rehabilitation center, and they were like, you should go for singing, because I would go to open mic nights and karaoke bars, and like I'd sing around town, and like, you should go audition. And I was like, okay. So like, I think, because this was like a long time ago, over a decade ago. I believe my aunt took me because she lived there in a certain part of Austin. So she drove me, and it's kind of like they put you in this big room with everybody, and then they kind of have some of the representatives up at the front, like talking about what they're looking for. You know, all these different things, just like basic cliff notes about what it means to be assigned talent, and things like that. So then what they do is they give you a number, and then the agents go disperse into their own room. And then you're kind of just waiting around all day for them to call you. And yeah, so it was kind of nerve wracking because I really didn't know what to expect. So then I go into the room, and then I have these two agents in front of me. And yeah, it was really weird to go in expecting, like, you know, to be recognized for singing. And then they kind of throw that curveball at you. Well, have you thought about modeling? And something I want to say too is, like, if you go to any of these casting calls, because there's all kinds of casting calls like this, even for like smaller level agencies that are kind of like regional focused. If they're really pushy about making you purchase like classes with the modeling academy that they're affiliated with, that probably means it's a scam. So I just wanted to throw that in there, because I know a lot of people who kind of have fallen victim to that. So anyway, when this agent told me, like, oh, have you thought about modeling? Number one, I thought she was joking. And then number two, I was like, okay, what's she going to try to sell me on? But she didn't try to sell me on anything. She's just like, well, I think you should look into it, you know? And it was, so basically also too, after that, they are like, okay, we'll call you within 48 hours if we want to meet with you again or represent you. So they called me the next day, and she told me, she's like, you know, you don't really have any experience with modeling. You don't really have a portfolio. And I know that's not really what you came in for anyway. She's like, but if it is something you're interested in, I do think that you should get some training in that, build up a portfolio, and just kind of go to different agencies, whether it's in your area or if you're willing to move somewhere and go, you know, to casting calls and things like that. She's like, I think you would do great at it. So she just kind of gave me some advice and didn't really push me to necessarily sign up with classes at that local acting and modeling academies, which is kind of how I knew, like, her words were genuine, and it wasn't like she was trying to get those people just to take my money. So I never ended up auditioning for Wilhelmina again, but I guess like her belief in me at that time was kind of the catalyst that made me want to kind of dip my toe in there and freelance myself, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And that's actually what I was going to ask you next is, if you felt that way, if you felt like her believing in you, you know, helped in your journey. So it sounds like the answer to that is yes. So then my follow-up question to that would be, did blindness come up in that interview at all, that audition?
No, I mean, and obviously they knew I was blind too, because I mean, I went in with my cane and everything. And she never even said like, oh, you're different, and like, you know, this would make everything so diverse. She literally just said like, you have a good look, and you have a nice presence, and I think there's something about you that would excel. That was literally all she said, which I really appreciated. You know, and I'm kind of in the lucky position that my first ever exposure to going to a casting call or doing anything like that was so positive, because I know for a lot of people, it's not that way. And that's not to say that after that, other auditions and things I went to weren't bad experiences, because I had plenty of those as well. Let's be for real. You know, fitness and fashion modeling and commercial modeling, any kind of modeling in that industry, like, it's a lot of it is about accepting rejection, because you're not always going to be everybody's cup of tea, whether you're disabled or not. Like, you're going to get a bunch of no's before you hear yeses. So you have to have a thick skin. And, you know, I think that already facing so much rejection, being a blind woman, even before that, had kind of like primed me for a certain level of resilience that I was just like, okay, I've been told worse. Who cares? Let's move on to the next one.
That's awesome. and I love what you said about building up resilience. So much of performing in general is you have to have a thick skin, exactly like you said. So definitely a great takeaway for our listeners, to know that you can still become successful even after so much rejection. So I want to jump back to this topic of a TFP. I think that's what you said it's called.
Yes.
So you said you trade, sort of your time and your modeling for a photographer's, skills essentially, and they'll go in your portfolio and then their portfolio. So are those also paid, or is that more for beginners?
So TFP is more so for beginners. It's like I said, like you are exchanging each other's time for something that is mutually beneficial. Exactly. So TFP is free. So like, for example, if you're a starting out model and I'm a starting out photographer, you need photos for your portfolio. I need practice shooting models for my portfolio. That's mutually beneficial. Now, if you're just starting out modeling and I've been a photographer for X amount of years and you come to me and be like, hey, do you want to do some TFP? More than likely, I'm going to tell you, no, these are my rates because I don't need the practice. You do.
I see.
Yeah, so that's basically what TFP is now. There are sometimes every now and then there are experienced photographers that will do TFP with less experienced models, or experienced models for free if it's something that they need in their portfolio. So if like I'm a fashion photographer and I have a bunch of photos in my portfolio that are based around fashion, evening gowns and clothing and all these things, but I need more swimwear or I need more lingerie or I need a fitness model, then I would probably be willing to work with a fitness model for TFP because it's something I need. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes perfect sense.
And even so, the fitness model would be very well within their right to say, well, fitness model is my bread and butter. That's what I do best. So no, I would prefer if you paid me X amount. And then it's an exchange of time, energy, and sometimes money, basically, is what it is. It has to be mutually beneficial. Because I've had plenty of people come up to me and be like, oh, I want to shoot you for free, blah, 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 blah. It's going to be all fitness. And I'm like, cool, I've been published in several big name fitness magazines. Like, this is what I'm going to charge. And they're like, oh, but I was hoping we could do TFP. And I'm like, I'm sorry, because it's if it's not worth my time. Like if it's a photographer, I look at their work, or my fiance or my friends look at their work and be like, wow, they have like a really good eye for whatever, like their images look really good. Then I'm more inclined to say, oh yeah, we'll trade time for print. But if their photos are just lackluster or don't compare to anything I already have in my portfolio, then absolutely I'm going to charge them.
That makes perfect sense. So for those who might be new to modeling or, sort of just starting out, could you explain just some of the different types of modeling? Like, what is a fitness model? Are you modeling sort of, sportswear, or is it more weights, or what is it? And any other types that you're familiar with, just for our listeners.
So a lot of the difference between the different types of modeling, the different genres, yes, have to do with what you're modeling, but also they're used to kind of categorize body types, right? So typically your fashion models are going to be a size 0 or a size 2, although now, especially I'd say within the past 7 years, petite models that are like, under the typical 5'9", are becoming a little more prevalent. We have, more curvy models now as well, doing high fashion and runway. But typically, I'm going to say like a majority of the time, your fashion / runway models are going to be slender and tall. I could go into a whole thing of why that is, but basically, back in the day, that was set as the standard because it's cheaper to make really small clothing, for a smaller body type than it is to make a whole collection using more fabric, especially if it's like really high fashion, you're using these expensive fabrics. But that was the basis why that was instilled back in the day. And now it's becoming a little less common. So that's good. But yeah, so that's like typically what a fashion model would be. So like for me specifically, since I have more of an athletic look, I probably would not get picked to model evening gowns or something that is seen to be very delicate and elegant because of my muscles. I'm not going to say never, but most big brands like Dolce & Gabbana, for example, or Vera Wang, you know, there's a reason why their dresses run so small. It's because they're really not the branding that they're built for isn't really meant for my body type, which is kind of sad. But at the end of the day, if you're going to get into modeling, you need to know those things. That way, you know where you're going to fit. So for me, for fitness modeling, that could be anything from modeling gym clothes. That can be swimwear. It can be exercise videos. It can even be commercial modeling. So, you know, doing commercials for gyms or supplementation products and things like that. So that brings me into the commercial modeling space. So commercial modeling is more so like billboards, commercials, obviously, catalogs, things like that. So like, if you're doing like an ad for like Macy's or Dillard's, that can be considered commercial modeling, even though they sell fashion. It's more so like for advertising purposes, if that makes sense. And then of course your curvy models, you know, you're going to be probably a size 12 or higher if you're going to do plus size modeling. And yeah, like you know, then it gets a little more technical, like, oh, swimwear models, boudoir models. But for swimwear and boudoir, you can really be whatever size. You can be a typical size 0, size 2 fashion model, or you can be a more curvaceous model. It just depends what it's for and what the photographer is looking for, or the specific brand, what image it is that they're trying to portray.
I understand. Okay. That makes a lot more sense. And it's really good for our listeners to be able to have that background knowledge before considering this field. So I want to switch gears just a little bit. Only slightly. When people think, okay, you know, there's a model and, you know, this person has a disability, for some reason, they assume that the person is only going to model disabled related items, or, you know, like, for example, if you're blind, you'll model canes. If you're a wheelchair user, you'll model wheelchairs, which obviously is ridiculous. What's been your experience around marketing yourself as a model? And, you know, has blindness come up, and what have you done? I know I'm asking 3 questions. And what have you done to sort of advocate for equality in those spaces?
So that's a good question. And pretty much, I mean, at the end of the day, all I can really say is just be yourself. You know what I mean? Even if there's a reason why there's so many girls that are moving to, say, like New York or Los Angeles, trying to become a model. It's because at that point, like, it's very subjective. You know what I mean? Like, some agencies or some brands, whatever it is you're auditioning for, like, some are going to like the more curvy models. Some are going to like the skinnier models. Some are going to like somebody who has an edge about them. Some people are going to like tattoos. Some people are not. Some people are going to be wanting to diversify their roster or their campaign. Some are not. You're not always going to be everybody's cup of tea. So at the end of the day, really all you can do is be yourself, because there's only one you. And if you're trying to be like everybody else, you're just going to blend in. There's not going to be anything about you that is going to stand out. And that's how, honestly, I ended up getting published in Oxygen magazine, which is the #1 women's workout magazine, and Strong Fitness magazine, which is definitely within the top 5. It was because I just told my story. I submitted my photos that a really good fitness photographer, Casey Withers, took of me. And I just submitted my story, said, this is who I am. This is what I do. This is what I'm about. And that was what got me in those magazines. Had I left that part out about the disability, I probably just would have looked like another 5'8" blonde tattooed girl trying to be a fitness model. Now, that's not to say that they only published me because I was disabled. It also had a lot to do with, #1, I looked the part. #2, I lead by example. I talk the talk and I walk the walk. But I'm also a very good speaker and storyteller. So I've curated my way of presenting myself to a way that's going to stand out. So that's the biggest thing I can tell anybody is stand out in an industry like fashion or modeling or anything artsy. Even if you're into music, you have to stand out or you're just going to blend in. And that doesn't mean putting your disability necessarily at the forefront, but it is something that's going to be a little different than what these people are used to seeing on a daily basis, and is quite frankly kind of boring.
Yeah, I love what you just said. It's actually really, really similar to what another one of our guests said in our June episode. This episode's going to be airing in July. But in our June episode, she was very much talking about embracing your individuality and just being comfortable with who you are. So I'm very glad to hear that that's something that is relevant in modeling as well. So my question is, you spoke a bit about the application process, is what I sort of have, coined it. I don't know if it's called that, so you can totally correct me. So I'm assuming you submit your cover letter, or sorry, not your cover, your writing about yourself, your bio, maybe? I don't know what it's called. Correct me about all these things. Your bio, your portfolio. Is there anything else? And are these the right terms?
So it really just depends what it is that people are auditioning for. So like if I was submitting to like an online casting agency to see if they'd want to bring me in for an interview, which I have done before for an agency in Houston, basically they would want specific headshots. So usually like a close up, a side profile, a 3/4 body, and a full body. And then it would kind of ask like your measurements, what kind of modeling you're interested in, kind of what your history is with modeling, so on and so forth. So that's usually what the online casting agency applications look like. So to get in those magazines, so there's two different ways that you can submit to get into magazines. If you're with an agency, usually they'll have kind of like connections to where they can directly submit. And obviously those tend to like get through first at the top because you have representation. But for me, I don't have representation. I've always just represented myself and been freelance. So what I did is I really did my research and sought out these magazines that, number one, I felt like fit with my personal brand. And then, I reached out personally, especially some magazines will kind of have a link on their main website that says like submissions, and then it'll tell you if they're taking submissions or not, what they're looking for. Not all will, but some will. Or there's also even like a contact button. So even if they're not looking for submissions, maybe you can reach out and say like, hey, I'm really interested in being in your magazine. Sometimes they'll respond, sometimes they won't. Like I said, it's a lot of hit or miss, especially if you're doing it on your own like I did. So what I did was, those two magazines I submitted for were taking submissions. I reached out and I sent them my photos and like a little brief bio about myself. And then they hit me back in my email and said like, hey, we're interested and we'd like to feature you in whatever section of our magazine. And then based off of the information I submitted, they kind of sent me like follow-up questions that they wanted to, for me to answer for the interview part of where they would be featuring me in the magazine.
I see. Okay, so it sounds like one of those processes where maybe starting out, it's not necessarily challenging, but it might be a little more legwork. But once you've got your portfolio and your bio is already written, you can just kind of keep using the same information, and unless you need updated photos, right?
Yeah, and it's a lot of legwork. If you're not represented by an agency, like you don't have those connections deep within the industry. So it is a lot of research trying to figure out who you need to contact, especially if they don't have a submissions tab that's just blatantly obvious there on their website. So yeah, it's not easy at all. And like, again, you're going to reach out to a lot of people and not hear anything back, or you're going to reach out to people and they're going to be like, sorry, it's just not a good fit, or it's not what we're looking for. All that stuff. So you have to know the industry and you have to know what it is that you're submitting for. And you have to be honest with yourself too, and be like, do I really have the personal branding that aligns with this magazine? Like, I'm never going to reach out to Vogue and be like, oh, feature me, because I'm not really the typical model that they would put in there anyway. But also, number two, it's a very kitschy kind of brand, and you just have to know what it is that you're submitting to and be realistic with yourself when you're submitting.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. So speaking of companies like Vogue, which sort of have those stereotypes of, models must be, skinny, or, you mentioned tattoos earlier, can't have tattoos, all these, different ideas. Could you sort of break some myths? Because I feel like those stereotypes have become synonymous with modeling in general. And it sounds like what you're saying is that, especially in today's world and in today's industry, there's a lot more room for various types of models.
Yeah. So I don't remember if it was Vogue. I think it may have been Vogue or Vogue Italia, or maybe one of those other really big name fashion influencer magazines. They have had people with disabilities on there before, but of course, those were people that were represented by big name agencies. So, like those bigger magazines, more than likely the models that you see in there are going to have big name agency representation, like Ford, Wilhelmina, Storm, Elite, all of those. But yeah, so I think that the industry is becoming a little more progressive, because even if you go to like the Victoria's Secret website, like, back in the day, Victoria's Secret models were 5'9" or taller, and a size 0 or a size 2, maybe a size 4, just depending. Now, if you look, they're really making an effort to include more average size models, that are more like the typical like size 6 or size 8. And then, commercial modeling, in my opinion, has like the most diversity, because if you look at commercials, like you see a bunch of ability statuses now, more so than ever. In my opinion, there's room for more, but it's still better than what it was. There's tons of different races. You'll see more LGBTQ representation in commercials and advertisements now. So commercial modeling is a really good place to start, I think, if that is something that somebody wants to explore. But also too, with commercial modeling, something to keep in mind is that they usually want you to take some acting classes or have acting experience as well, because commercial modeling isn't just print like in catalogs or advertisements. It's also literally commercials. So like, for example, when I went to an agency casting for their commercial modeling division, they did tell me like I would be able to do advertisements for like Dillard's and Macy's and JCPenney's, but my tattoos may serve as an issue, because they're kind of like, those ads are kind of like more like, look at me, girl next door, kind of like family oriented stuff. Some of the tattoos could be seen as a little edgy, but they told me what we could end up doing is you could do the modeling for like their winter line, where you're like, your tattoos are covered, and your fitness physique isn't going to really matter, like, because you'll still be able to see you're in good shape. But it was mostly the tattoos that were going to be the problem. Now, for fitness modeling, most fitness models nowadays have tattoos, because, when you're muscular, it is a more edgy look, and the tattoos kind of coincide with that edgier look. And yeah, I mean, even now, if you look at certain like fashion shows and stuff, like the models nowadays, they have like differently colored hair, like pink hair, silver hair, black and white hair. And like, it's kind of just changing. But again, it really just depends on the brand. That's really what it boils down to. Your branding, and if it fits with the market that you're trying to model for, if it matches their branding. So like Nordstrom, for example, I think for the past like 7 years, they've been making an effort each year to do a campaign featuring people with disabilities. So I've seen like people in wheelchairs, and what's another one? It's escaping me right now. There's another brand that also has kind of been following in suit. And Tommy Hilfiger, I think it was Tommy Hilfiger recently came out with an adaptive clothing line for people, who need adaptive clothing to dress themselves and things like that. So things are definitely changing, and the stereotypes about disabled people not necessarily being interested in fashion is definitely kind of dissipating, but it still has a long way to go. I mean, even in the beauty industry, because recently within the past 4 years, I started really getting interested in makeup. I took lessons to learn how to do a full glam face of makeup without my vision. And that really opened a lot of doors for me, to where I started getting interested in wanting to do beauty cosmetic modeling now. So that's my next goal, is to align myself with a beauty brand and see about, either being in a campaign for that or an ambassador for their company. And maybe one day even starting my own accessible makeup line of my own. But that's, 5+ years from now, because it takes a lot of money to get into the manufacturing side of things and things like that. But yeah, like, long story short, because I know that was a very winded answer, the industry is changing and it is getting better, but it has a long way to go still.
That's awesome. And I love what you mentioned about, learning to do makeup. I remember when I was younger, my friends are doing their makeup and I was like, oh, I was interested in, there really weren't many resources out there. Whereas today, just a YouTube search will, have several people showing you how to do makeup without looking. So I'm a huge fan of, everything that you're working toward. So it's often said that confidence comes from within. But in this world of body shaming and, people sighted, blind, or otherwise looking for validation on social media, various eating disorders, and, the more unhealthy, whether it be physically or mentally, sides of modeling, how do you, suggest that I'm thinking specifically of blind people because I feel like in some ways blind people rely a little bit more on a sighted person's perception of their beauty. But how do you suggest that blind people stay confident?
Just do things that make you happy. I'm a big fan of health because, I'm a personal trainer and I work as a fitness coach, and, I do people's nutrition and workouts, and I train them in person and online and all that stuff. I'm not really a fan of defining health and wellness based on a specific size or a subjective number on a scale. I define health and wellness and overall well-being. Just, I guess you can say, just the way that you feeling good. Now, obviously, if you're extremely overweight and at risk for like diabetes and things like that, I'm going to tell you, love yourself enough to take care of yourself better. But that doesn't necessarily mean to put value in being a size 0 or a size 2. At the end of the day, I just want people to be healthy and love yourself enough to take care of yourself from the inside out. So confidence, I mean, especially if you are in a position to where you don't know, I guess, your outer value. I mean, I guess that's a term. Just do things that make you happy. Like for me, fitness was something that made me happy. I didn't necessarily do it to get into it for anybody else. I got into it for me. I wanted to feel better about myself. And it became a stress reliever for me. And yes, looking good was obviously a perk of that. But at the end of the day, like, there's tons of people, and I can attest to this being in the fitness industry, even the people who look really, really good, a lot of them still struggle with confidence, believe it or not, and mental health. And it's because they only addressed the outside and they didn't work on themselves on the inside. So as much as I would like to say, like, don't put your value in what other people think of you. I know it's really hard to do that, especially because I have a master's degree in psychology. So, we follow what we call the biopsychosocial model. So mental health is not only biological, like, it can have a lot to do with the way our brain is wired, our genetics, psychological. So our thought processes, correcting negative thinking patterns, the way that we speak about ourselves verbally and internally, and then social. So where you come from, the people that you're hanging out with. So with all that being said, to fix the biological, eat right, exercise, get moving, psychological, monitor the way that you speak to yourself. Like if you're going to look in the mirror and tell yourself every day, oh, I'm such a fat lard, like obviously you're going to feel that way, all day. Your actions that you do are going to fall in line with that negative stereotype that you've built about yourself. And then social, if you're hanging around with a bunch of people who just bring you down or don't want you to succeed, well, you're just going to be stuck. Like that's literally the definition of insanity, is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Nothing changes if nothing changes. So at the end of the day, confidence is built. It's not something we're born with. It's not something that comes easier to some people than others. Like it's literally built, and to maintain it requires effort. And you have to love yourself enough to put in that effort, because even me, I still struggle with mental health every now and then because I'm human. But it's just about not staying in it and just recognizing that your self-worth is so much more than what you look like or what other people think about you. You could be the brightest, you could be the ripest peach in the bunch, and there's going to be somebody who doesn't like peaches, you know? So really, yeah, confidence at the end of the day, it's built, and that's 100% something that's within your control.
I love everything that you just said and agree with it wholeheartedly. So now that we've broken some of those myths and stereotypes, and people can feel comfortable going into modeling, and they have some tools, and different things to keep in mind. I'm wondering now, how do you suggest that people get involved? Today with there's so many different options for entering the modeling world. These are just social media, the TFPs, agencies, something else entirely. You mentioned personal branding. What do you think?
So nowadays with social networking and things like that, I think the best way to go about it is, so if you have like the financial resources, because it does help, I'm not gonna lie, having a financial backing does help, especially with whatever hobby it is, having the means to do so. If you've never really had a photo shoot done before, then I'd suggest hiring a photographer and paying them, because when you pay an expert, you're guaranteed to get good photos, especially if you're trying to build a portfolio. And then once you have a portfolio and photos that you can submit, if you're interested in going the agency route, then by all means, do that. And if you're just looking for practice to get comfortable in front of the camera, obviously you can have a friend take photos for you. It doesn't mean that they're going to come out great, but just getting comfortable in front of the camera, because I think that's a big thing with modeling, even fitness in general. When I'm working with potential clients in consultations, a lot of people like the idea of something, but they're not willing to put in the work. So like, I can have clients that like the idea of losing 50 pounds, but realistically, they're not willing to put in the work yet. They don't want to work out 3+ days a week. They don't want to meal prep. And, well, if you just like the idea of something and you're not willing to put in the work, you're not going to get very far with it. So with modeling, especially if you have a visual impairment, it's very visual. So that doesn't mean that it can't be done, but that means it is going to require a lot more practice and effort on your part. So you're going to have to get familiar with angling your body. You're going to have to get familiar with being comfortable in front of the camera. You're going to have to get familiar with all that stuff. So practice, practice, practice. So if you do decide to join a Facebook group, for example, for networking with makeup artists, models, and photographers, you can go in there and you can post like, hey, I'm an aspiring model and I would like to collaborate with somebody on a TFP project to get images for my portfolio. You may get a photographer who is decently experienced, but usually you're going to get beginner photographers, and those images may or may not be good. Like, I'm just realistic. You know what I mean? Sometimes they'll be great. Sometimes they'll be good enough for what you need at that point in time. But if you have the money, I'm always going to tell you, if you're trying to build a book or a portfolio, invest in that photographer, because you are going to get exactly what you're paying for. And also don't be afraid to ask for references as well. That's with anything. But yeah, if you're just trying to get comfortable with being in front of the camera and practicing, then definitely like do some TFP with a photographer or even makeup artists. There's even makeup artists in those groups that are like needing faces to practice makeup on and things like that. But yeah, so there's just explore all the options. That's really all I can say, is there's just so many possibilities when it comes to how you want to go about that. And it also just depends what your goal is. If your goal is to be represented by an agency one of these days, then yeah, I'm going to recommend that you pay a photographer to take your photos. Now, with that being said, there are these stories of like, oh, I submitted to an agency and I took my headshots with a camera and they thought I was just so beautiful and blah, 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 blah. Yes, agencies do look for natural beauty, but more times than not, those people are the mythical unicorns of the scenario. So at the end of the day, that's really all I can say, is just make sure that if you're submitting photos, make sure they're flattering and they're not something you took in poor lighting with your camera phone.
Yes, that is very good advice. So before we sign off, I always ask this question at the very end, which is, how can our listeners keep up with you? How can they get in touch with you if they have more questions or follow you on social media or anything like that?
So I mostly just direct everybody to my Instagram because it's really easy to remember. And I do check my messages on there quite a bit. My Instagram handle is @culprit, CULP as in people, B as in boy, RIT. And yeah, I mean, that's really the best place to get a hold of me. It's where I usually get a lot of my inquiries. And there's even an email button on there that will send your message to my email if you want to send me an email or a direct message, however you want to go about it.
I love that Instagram handle. It's awesome. Well, thank you so much just for joining us today and having a positive discussion about modeling. You've really shown the depth of the industry. And I mean that as far as, stereotype breaking, myth busting, and just the ins and outs of it.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Yeah, the world really needs that. So thank you. And thank you to the listeners for keeping us going. Oh, and let us know if we should do an episode on personal branding. As soon as you were mentioning that, I was like, wow, that would be fascinating because all performers need to know what their values are and what their brand should look like. So let us know that in the comments on YouTube or just shoot us an email. And I'm so grateful to have everyone who was involved with this episode. And with that, this has been another episode of Scene Change.
I'm Caitlin McIntyre, president of the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Scene Change. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit our website at nfb-pad.org. There you'll find links to our social media, membership, and resources for blind performers. Thanks to everyone who makes this show happen. Scene Change is produced by Shane Lowe, Joe Schuneman, Precious Perez, Chris Nussbaum, Seun Choi, and Aaron Jordan, with music by Ryan Strunk and Tom Page. Remember, you can be the performer you want. Blindness is not what holds you back. We'll see you next time.